Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this public hearing, a meeting conducted by the New York State Compensation Committee. We're really pleased that you're all here to provide testimony and to have a brief report from the committee. I'm joined by my fellow members, Chairman Bill Thompson, Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, Comptroller Scott Stringer. And I'll introduce the other gentleman in a minute. We're here because we have been voluntarily accepted this responsibility to serve on the Compensation Committee.
Wait, what'd you say?
All right, then. We'll strike that on the record. The committee's job is to really examine the adequacy of compensation for state legislators and commissioners and other executive employees of the state. In doing that, we have to look at several appropriate factors in terms of making a decision with respect to whether or not we should go forward to make a raise. Those factors have been shown at the present time on the board. That's our legislation. These are the factors that we're supposed to consider. We have one other meeting that has been scheduled, which will be the final meeting of this committee, and it will be held here at the SUNY Global Center, and on, what is the date? December 6th at 2:30 p.m. We're also joined today by our counsel, Alan Klinger. We want to thank him for his services here. He is serving as pro bono from the Strick firm as the counsel to the committee. Alan, welcome.
Thank you.
And now we'll proceed with Scott Stringer. Comptroller Stringer will go through the comparisons. The law states that we should look at how salaries for our legislators and our public officials, how they compare to other state, federal, city agencies and the private sector. And we thank Comptroller Stringer for putting together this material for us.
Well, happy to, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the members of the commission. Let me start with the beginning. This committee was created, as many of you know, as part of the 2019 state budget. Members are familiar with the mission. The legislature has asked us to lay out factors for the committee to consider, including the cost of living, growth in the state budget, other jurisdictions, private sector compensation, and other factors. This is how we measured some of those factors over the period since the last pay raise, which was 1998, and 2017 is the latest year for which we have complete data. So we used inflation. You were using the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. We're looking at public spending, the change in state general fund spending. We've also compared with other jurisdictions, highest paid states in New York City. Also private sector, change in earnings of comparable private sector positions and industries. So just benchmarking New York State overall, we're the fourth largest population, third largest economy, second largest state funds operating budget excluding federal aid. As we go to the legislature and the comparisons, for the record, the legislative base pay is $79,500. The last increase was in 1998. We have allowances for certain positions, and we also have per diem rate for session days and mileage. Going forward, we're going to use the same format for all of our comparison charts. So the yellow bar at the far left is New York State. The blue is the comparison with other jurisdictions, as you see with Pennsylvania and California. Pink is the inflation and state budget spending growth, and green is the change in private sector comparison. Compensation. So the legislature, which is what we're dealing with right this second, the two highest paid state legislatures, as you see from the chart, is Pennsylvania and California. If pay increased at the rate of inflation, you see we would be up 54% to $121,000. If pay increased at a rate of state spending growth, we'd be up to 83% or $145,000. If pay increased at a rate of private sector pay growth in the legal field, roughly we would double this in the last 20 years to $160,000. Statewide elected officials, the last pay increase for them was also in 1998. And using the same grid from yellow, blue, pink, and green, we see that the governor's last pay increase was to $179,000. Lieutenant governor, attorney general, and controller make $151,000. Again, the same metrics, highest paid in other states, budget growth, private sector. Let's take a look at the governor. Two highest paid governors are Pennsylvania and California, up to $195,000. New York City mayor is $258,000. Private sector earnings growth for chief executive pay has doubled. And moving to lieutenant governor, two highest paid lieutenant governors, Pennsylvania's at $163,000, Colorado's at $153,000. New York City public advocate, which we put in just as a New York City comparison, makes $184,000. Going to attorney general, the two highest paid attorney generals, Tennessee weighs in at $185,000, Wyoming at $175,000. And using, again, the New York City model, we looked at the New York City Corp Council is at $226,000. Controllers are valued in Tennessee, $201,000, and Washington State, $179,000. The New York City controllers, $209,000, worth every penny. Next, Section 169. These are executive appointees. There's 6 levels that were also set in 1999. Top commissioner pay is $136,000. Executive appointees, if you did some comparison, as you can see, based on inflation, budget growth, or private sector earnings growth, commissioners should be making between $230,000 and, in some cases, more than $300,000. Selected titles compared to other states in New York City commissioners are below the median for most positions and are often at near or bottom. New York City commissioners generally make up to $90,000 more than their state counterparts. So there you have our analysis, and hope it's helpful.
Thank you, Comptroller Stringer. Next, we're going to hear from Comptroller DiNapoli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for those who joined us at our hearing at Albany, a reiteration of the points that I made at that event the other day. As I think everybody knows by now, we have a website that's been set up, nyscompensation.ny.gov. This is a significant way for us to communicate information with the public and to receive information from the public. Not everybody can come to these hearings, so the website is an easy way for comments to be shared with this committee. Meeting documents and recorded webcasts are accessible through the website, and as is happening today, meetings are being webcast live, and hopefully there are many people viewing our deliberations today. In terms of some of the comparisons, looking at the question of legislative stipends compared to other entities, you can see on the left the comparison with our neighboring states that have similar compensation levels, Pennsylvania, California, the U.S. Congress, and the New York City Council, identifying the size of each legislative body, the range of the stipends, and the column there, whoops, go back for a second. Yep, the column there, number of stipends received. Obviously, New York State is very different in terms of the number of stipends that are received. Turning to the next page, summary distribution of New York State base pay and stipends. This breaks down the distribution of salary and stipend and numbers of legislators. Appropriate to point out that there are 53 members of the legislature who receive no stipend at all. And then the following page spells out and details the current stipends for legislators in the Senate and Assembly, and, I'm sorry, comparisons with the other states. Congress, Pennsylvania, California. And then just a reminder that there has been commentary in the press on the subject that we're considering.
Thank you, Comptroller DiNapoli. And now we'll call on Comptroller Thompson, who will make comments and will conduct the hearing.
Okay, let me thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. In order to facilitate an orderly and informative hearing let me briefly outline the procedure under which the hearing will be conducted. The nature of this hearing is to receive testimony on compensation issues. While we don't want to appear to be unsympathetic to other points of view, the more we hear on the subjects relevant to the hearing on compensation, the more effective will be to us as committee members. While the members may find it necessary to ask occasional questions for the purpose of clarification, we respectfully ask participants to refrain from directing specific questions to us. It's not a dialogue. We shall start the hearing by listening to the persons who have sent their request in advance pursuant to a public announcement at the beginning of the month and who have indicated they wish to make formal presentations. These speakers will be limited to 5-minute statements. After 4 minutes, our timekeeper will signal to indicate that 4 minutes has elapsed. So let me thank all of you. At the 5-minute mark, the timekeeper will signal again, and at that time, we'll ask the speaker please terminate his or her remarks. Following completion of the formal presentations, we'll be pleased to hear from those persons who have indicated to the hearing registration officer that they wish to offer brief extemporaneous comments of up to 3 minutes. The timekeeper will signal after 2 minutes have elapsed and will signal at the 3-minute mark to indicate that the speaker's time has expired. One final information item, these proceedings are being taped for the record. And let me start with, we're pleased that the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, Speaker Carl Heastie, has come in to speak to us. Mr. Speaker, I believe that you're up front. And again, thank you for coming in and speaking to us. Come on down. Carl Heastie, come on down.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And we submitted a formal testimony, but my comments will be a summation of that testimony. So good morning, Chairman McCall, Chairman Thompson, Controller DiNapoli, and Controller Stringer. Thank you for affording me the opportunity to speak at this meeting of the New York State Compensation Committee. Please again note that I've submitted to you my 2016 letter in support of a salary adjustment, as well as a new updated letter. My testimony today summarizes these letters. First, I'd like to express my gratitude to each of you for taking the time to participate in this process. We know that your commitments to serving the city and the state of New York are extensive. In particular, you each possess a wealth of financial expertise, as well as the government experience, which will be valuable in this process. I'm here today on behalf of the members of the New York State Assembly. This year marks the 20th year since an increase in compensation was authorized for members of the New York State Legislature. Under any objective measure, our static compensation has failed to keep pace with economic realities. Over the last 20 years, consumer price index in New York State has risen well over 50%, while our salaries have remained the same. The medical CPI has expanded by well over 80%, making it nearly impossible for some members to provide necessary care for dependent children and aging family members. Child care costs have doubled. The CPI for housing has increased by more than 65%, and the interest rates are on the rise. And the base salary for legislators has remained at $79,500. And since the four of you are controllers, you understand what it means when I say the purchasing power of that salary has diminished to $51,401. During this same period, the state median household income has risen by 67%. Legislators are not insulated from the financial pressures that are experienced by their constituents. They too must finance college loans, meet the cost of child care, and provide for the well-being of elderly parents and loved ones at home. Nearly 2/3 of the Assembly represent New York City, Long Island, and suburban Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam counties. These are areas with a high total cost of living, some comprising the highest cost of living in the nation, making the impact of a frozen compensation structure even more acute. Let us not forget the increase in complexity and demands of the position of a New York State Assembly member, which includes the drafting and adoption of an annual state budget of more than $170 billion, an amount that has grown by 160% since our last salary adjustment. The budget approval process is intense, involving prolonged periods of public hearings, internal discussion, negotiations with our partners in government, and drafting bills to adjust both fiscal and policy considerations. It should be noted that as complex as this process is, the budget has passed in a timely manner for the last 8 years. And the budget is only one aspect of the work a legislator undertakes. With a population of 19.8 million people, New York State is one of the most diverse states in the nation in terms of geography, economics, ethnicity, race, religion, and political opinion. Legislators must consider and address a range of issues that are considered by 37 standing committees and 13 joint legislative commissions. Members research, draft, and introduce bills. They review hundreds of bills introduced by their colleagues. They meet with and hear the opinions of members of the public and advocates. They attend committee meetings, public hearings, roundtables, and conferences year-round. When in their districts, members spend significant time and effort meeting with constituents, responding to local concerns, attending community events, and addressing community needs, activities that take place 7 days a week throughout the year. The contention that New York State legislators are part-time employees is a technical legal conclusion, is not representative of our responsibilities. It is critical that an increase in compensation or cost of living adjustment for members of the legislature be received this year. A long overdue salary adjustment will encourage individuals of diverse backgrounds to enter public service, participate in the political process, and promote democracy by a true citizen legislature. Any increase in compensation must be adjusted and indexed to meet the annual rate of inflation at a minimum. My colleagues and I are ever mindful that there is a hardworking constituent behind every state tax dollar, as well as an expectation that these funds are spent wisely. It is essential that New Yorkers understand that support for an increase in compensation or cost of living adjustment for members of the legislature will not compromise critical investments in the health, safety, and prosperity of our state. Funding to increase the salary of legislators based on the CPI would amount to an increase in state funding by 1/10,000th of 1% of state operating funds. In conclusion, I impress upon you that the New York State Assembly has always put forth a families first agenda. Our priority is to ensure that New Yorkers can afford to remain in their communities, take care of their loved ones, while contributing to our local economies. We're asking for the same opportunity for the members of the New York State Legislature. The title of Assembly member is distinguished, but not as distinguished as the titles bestowed upon us by our loved ones: mother, father, son, daughter, grandparent, foster parent, caregiver. The members of the Assembly come from all walks of life. They share the stories of New Yorkers we represent. They are struggling to pay student loans. They are paying for child care. They have children in college. They are single parents. They have children with disabilities. They are caring for aging family members. They are grandparents helping to raise grandchildren. Legislators spend many days and weeks away from their families and loved ones, an important sacrifice by any measure in order to serve their communities. On behalf of my Assembly colleagues, I respectfully request your favorable consideration. Allow me to extend my heartfelt thanks for your participation in this process. Throughout your collective tenure, you have exemplified the best in public service. The residents of New York owe you each a debt of gratitude for your service. I'm happy to take questions you may have. How much time was that?
You got it down.
I know you got inside the 5. Questions?
Can I just, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate your input, and obviously your input is very important, as is all the input we're going to be hearing today. You mentioned the notion that legislators being part-time is perhaps a technicality, not a reality, and I can recall from my days there, you did as much work back home in the district as you did in
Sometimes
Albany.
more.
Sometimes more, absolutely right. And I know the Assembly in the past has voted on reforms in terms of dealing with that issue, and obviously there's been discussion out there about outside income, whether the legislature is full-time. Do you anticipate could you share with us your anticipation of what kind of proposals might be considered and voted on by the Assembly with regard to those issues?
Sure. We've always had a history of listening to the concerns and conflicts in regards to income and things like that. For instance, I could give you 2 examples. Just recently, we passed a rule that said if any legislator wanted to have more than $5,000 of income, it had to be approved by the Legislative Ethics Committee. That's one example. In the Assembly, we actually passed a piece of legislation that said that the majority of a legislative salary of the $79,000 still had to be the legislative salary still had to be more than 50% of the compensation, whether it's being a member of the legislature or on outside income. So I guess my message to you is we understand what people are saying. We've shown that we have, I'd say, an appetite to listening, but it's difficult to stand here and say what, because again, I'm going to be very consistent, and I've said this for the last 2 years, to agree to a specific piece of legislation in exchange for compensation is not something I'm even comfortable in doing. But I hear what people are saying, and I think that we've shown in the past that we've had an appetite to listen to reforms. The four of you are some of the most respected individuals in the history of this state and city in public service. And the issues that you raise, although I would like to remind you, requiring next year's legislature to do any recommendation would run afoul of, because a sitting legislature can't effectuate its own raise. So I just want to put that out there as a reminder. But Tom, Mr. Controller, but to answer your question, we're always willing to listen. I think most of you who have served with me and even the general public have known I'm a person, I've always been open and honest. And I could say we are open to hearing what people say.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
So first of all, I just want to say, as a former member of the Assembly, I think you really did outline very effectively the need for compensation and to address an issue that we haven't talked about successfully in 20 years. Legislators are among the hardest working public servants. They travel away from home, and they have the same challenges as people. Just to follow up on what Controller DiNapoli was talking about, in my view, this has become a full-time legislature, and I think you're 100% right. And in that regard, as we consider proposals, part of what we have to think about is how to look at a legislature, and I just want your thoughts on, could we limit outside income, and could we limit LULUs, but in eliminating that, could we also create a pay scale like the New York City Council that would meet the needs of your members? Just your
Again,
thoughts, not to,
no,
you know,
no. Again, my thoughts again are, I believe the relevant task of the commission is to what is the fair amount of a compensation, and that's for the four of you to decide. And I am asking for I understand I'm the Speaker of the Assembly, but I'm still only one of 150 members, and that's in our House. So it would be very difficult for me to stand here and say what I believe 213 or 212 other people would like to do. Again, like I said, recommendations that we take from the public, from all of you. In your roles as controllers, you submitted bills to the legislature. So I'd say things that you raise, I think the legislature would take what you say, your recommendations seriously. But I can't at this point tell you what I think people would be willing to do, because that would be totally inappropriate for me to do that.
Okay.
As far as, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you for coming in. We really appreciate that. The Senate, and while I realize that the Senate is turning over from Republican control to Democrat control, I believe that there has been positions expressed on the Senate side in the past, at least within the Democratic minority, about limitation of outside income. Could you speak to, I mean, without putting any words, how much of that are you aware of, and do you remember?
I mean, I haven't really tracked the Senate's bills, and I think once January comes, they'll see a new introduction of bills. I don't know if I can want to so much live on what was put in, but I can only go back to what the leaders, the incoming leaders' comments were, that she did mention a bill, but the specifics of that bill, I do not know, to be honest.
Well, I think it's important for the record to note that Speaker Heastie came before this commission. We do think that the new Democratic majority in some form or fashion should communicate the way you're communicating, and I just want to say thank you, because you really didn't have to be here, and you made it very clear in the beginning that you were coming to answer questions and to give your thoughts.
Thank you.
I would just like to also thank you for being here today and for outlining not only your position and your very strong plea for why there should be an increase, but the fact that you've expressed this openness to listen and to consider a number of issues that have been raised by, not only by us, but by the public. And I would like to point out that I have personally talked to and invited the other majority and minority leaders from both houses, and they did convey to me their concerns and their issues, and I will share that with my colleagues. For whatever reason, they were not able to be here today, but they are very much aware of what's going on, and they too have expressed a willingness to listen to and to consider whatever recommendations we put forth. So we thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Elena Sassauer, Director of the Center for Judicial Accountability.
Just like to. Mr. Comptroller, I'd just like to point out that at some time I served as Comptroller, and I didn't have the opportunity to have a traveling group, a group travel with me. And to, it's very thick.
We've expanded our reach.
Thank you for, thank you for bringing it.
One of our friends.
That's right.
I don't have the copy of the speaker's letter. It's the first thing.
Or his testimony.
It's just you. We're not sure. Councilor Day.
Before beginning and before my time begins to run, I'd like to protest the restricted nature of this hearing, curtailing testimony so that it's no more than 5 minutes, no matter how serious and substantial. The fact is you had, at your last hearing 2 days ago, you had only 3 registrants plus an additional person, 4. Here, you also have only a handful. There is no reason that you shouldn't relax the time restrictions so that people who have taken their time and made the effort to prepare testimony can give you the benefit of what they have prepared. That being said, I am and have tried to limit my remarks. My name is Elena Sassauer. I'm director and co-founder of the Center for Judicial Accountability, a nonpartisan, nonprofit citizens organization that for the past 7 years has chronicled that the constitutional officers of our state's 3 government branches have been colluding to secure for themselves undeserved, unconstitutional pay raises by an unconstitutional commission scheme. That is the opening of the written statement that I have prepared and that has been distributed to you, as well as distributed a selection from our New York State Constitution relating to the budget and to the openness that the Constitution prescribes for the activities of the legislature. The written statement identifies that our website, www.judgewatch.org, has posted on it the evidence substantiating the written presentation that you have been provided and furnishes the proof of what has been going on with respect to these commission-based, compensation commissions. It identifies that posted are, in addition to the evidence, are 3 lawsuits that have been brought, that we have brought, challenging what's been going on with these commissions and their force of law recommendations. These 3 lawsuits, the first was a declaratory judgment action in 2012, and the subsequent 2 lawsuits were citizen taxpayer actions that not only addressed the unconstitutionality and unlawfulness of the statutes that created these compensation commissions, but additionally laid out the unconstitutionality and the unlawfulness of the budget. The second of the citizen taxpayer actions is still live and unfolding and at the Appellate Division, 3rd Department. And as identified in the written statement, it is essential that each of the committee members here and your counsel review the record of that second citizen taxpayer action so that you can know for certainty that you have nowhere to go with insofar as recommendations. Firstly, because the second citizen taxpayer action establishes that this commission scheme, this committee scheme, is unconstitutional for a myriad of reasons. The second reason that the citizen taxpayer action is so important, so critical, so dispositive, is that it establishes the first criteria, the first factor that you are required to take into account in making your recommendations. And you have skipped over that factor because all the financial, economic factors don't come to bear, are completely irrelevant where you haven't met the first criteria. And what is that? The statute requires that that the parties' performance and timely fulfillment of their constitutional and statutory responsibilities be taken into account. What the citizen taxpayer action demonstrates is that the budget is off the constitutional rails, is rife with constitutional violations, statutory violations, rule violations, and this is illustrative. It's not just the budget, but the legislative branch is not operating at any kind of constitutional level. All of this is laid out in the citizen taxpayer action. Mr. Hasty testified without any evidence.
Ms. Sasser, I'm going to have to ask you to conclude.
He made self-serving claims, all of which are rebutted.
I'm going to have to ask you to conclude.
Okay,
now.
then I will.
We have copies of your testimony.
I understand. So,
I want to hear the rest of your testimony.
thank
You guys
you.
can have a conversation outside.
I am identifying what I am furnishing you.
Okay.
And that is the appeal briefs and the 3-volume record on appeal that is presently before the Appellate Division en route to the Court of Appeals in the second citizen taxpayer action suing the governor, the legislature, Mr. Hasty by name, Mr. Flanagan by name as the temporary Senate president, the Senate, Controller DiNapoli, former Attorney General Schneiderman, the chief judge who was supposed to be among you, but I
Sasser,
understand
I'm
has
going to have to
recused
ask you to
herself.
conclude right
All
now.
right. So
Thank you.
this establishes that what
Thank
Mr. Hasty had to say about how hardworking, how responsive the Senate and the Assembly are is fraud,
There are other
is
people waiting.
deceit.
There are other people waiting to speak.
And with respect,
Thank
okay,
you.
now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Additionally, I'm handing
Call
up
it.
because the citizen taxpayer action chronicles the unconstitutionality and the lawlessness with respect to the
Ms.
state
Sassow,
budget.
that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
But the Brennan
so much.
Center for Justice issued reports going back to 2002, then 2006, 2008, where they chronicled that the legislature is the most dysfunctional in the country.
Ms. Sassower.
And they attribute it to the rules.
Ma'am, please.
They did not examine the budget, and so
Do you want to adjourn just for 5 minutes?
the Citizen Taxpayer Action is actually a companion to the important Brennan Center report.
Ma'am, thank you very much.
Your
Thank you.
comparisons to other
Thank you.
states,
Thank you.
Thank
well,
you.
maybe other states
Thank
are
you.
functional.
Thank you.
Maybe their legislatures
Thank you.
and their public officers
Thank
are
you.
not corrupt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And by the way,
You should call up
the
Susan.
legislation that created this commission is an unconstitutional rider.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank
The
you.
next person, Alex Camarda.
And you are concealing
Senior
them
Policy
as
Advisor
part of
from
the
reInvent
revenue
Albany.
bill.
Thank
What
you.
revenue
Thank
is
you.
produced by this,
you.
this Part HHH?
Ma'am.
Thank you.
It was
Excuse me, there's
inserted
someone else
after
waiting to
Behind closed doors, 3 men in a room, deal-making,
Thank you.
Thank you.
completely unlawful, unconstitutional.
Thank you.
And you need evidence, and the legislators need to come and deny
Alex.
and dispute what is laid out in the Citizen Taxpayer Action. Done deal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lastly,
No, we've already lastly.
as to what is going on in this current fiscal year budget, I testified twice, in January and in February, regarding the legislative budget, the judiciary
There's someone
budget.
right behind you who's waiting to speak, please.
Thank you.
It's all there.
Alex,
It's
sorry.
evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, committee members DiNapoli, McCall, Stringer, and Thompson. My name is Alex Camarda. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for reInvent Albany. reInvent Albany is a good government organization which advocates for open and accountable government. Thank you for your service to the committee and for holding this hearing today. I will also try to summarize my testimony as quickly as possible. As you can see from the written testimony we provided, our overarching recommendation is that a significant raise, meaning the 50% rate of inflation raise, be provided to state officials and lawmakers, and also 55% raise for statewide electeds, coupled with restrictions on outside income, LULUs, and per diems. And I'll provide some detail regarding the specifics. I should note at the outset, the restrictions on outside income we put forth in a report with our colleagues at NYPIRG and also Common Cause in 2015 that I've also submitted to the committee, and it provides the details that we're looking for with respect to restrictions on outside income. You're considering, this commission is considering three different classes of individuals. There's the lawmakers in the legislature, the statewide electeds, and the state officials, the agency commissioners. I'll speak about each of those. With respect to the legislature, as has been noted, the legislators make $79,500 in base pay, and 160 of 213 lawmakers earn anywhere from $10,000 to $41,000 more in LULUs for committee chairmanships and additional responsibilities. But I think it's notable that just 27 of those 213 lawmakers actually make more than $99,000 a year, including the LULUs, which is part of the reason we support a substantial pay raise. Lawmakers also earn per diems for travel of $175 per day for each day they're in the state capitol. During the last legislative session, that came to $10,500 for the 60 days of the legislative session, although in the past, some lawmakers have earned in excess of $20,000, depending on the days of session and the time they spent in the Capitol. So we support increasing lawmakers' base pay to $120,000 a year, and we support only the legislative leaders earning LULUs of an additional $25,000 for their increased responsibilities. That would bring the legislative leaders to $145,000 a year. And alongside of that, we believe there should be reforms related to compensation. First would be eliminating the LULUs for any other lawmakers but for the legislative leaders. Secondly, on per diems, we suggest a cap on per diems that would be calculated by a formula, which would be $175 a day for each day the members are in Albany, plus one additional $175 allotment for each week of session to allow lawmakers to go during off-session or for an additional night during the legislative session. And then with outside income, we believe it should be restricted, like it is for the U.S. Congress, to 15% of the highest paid lawmaker, which in our recommendations would be $145,000, which would restrict outside income to $21,750 or 15%. We also believe that lawmakers should further be prohibited from holding an outside job in which services offered involve a fiduciary relationship. So that would include legal or financial work or serving for pay on boards of nonprofits, corporations, or associations, or lending the member's name, for example, to a law firm. We do think lawmakers should be able to give speeches and do other honoraria, but they should have to give as donations any amount that they receive to that to charities that they're unaffiliated with. We also believe, with respect to outside income, that there should be restrictions on the manner in which lawmakers can invest in companies. Essentially, they should only be able to invest in ways that the general public can. With respect to the executive, we think the statewide elected officials, we believe they should receive a 55% increase to $215,000, 5% more than the agency heads, and also be subject to all the restrictions on outside income that we mentioned for lawmakers, in addition to financial disclosure for domestic partners and also banning royalties on any book deals. And with respect to the state officials, we think their salary should be increased 50%, which would take the highest paying commissioner to $205,000. We do believe that the different bands, there are 6 for the different agencies, should actually be revisited. We're not sure the rationale for those bands, but we think there should be more flexibility for the executive to provide a salary for the agency commissioners that are not as constricted as those bands. We think they could be eliminated or maybe narrowed so that there's no longer 6. The highest paid agency commissioners currently makes 50% more than the lowest, and some of the lower paid agency commissioners are actually serving very vulnerable populations through the services their agency provides. Lastly, on the phase-in and ties to performance and timeliness of the budget, we do think the state officials deserve a raise now. With respect to the phase-in, I think it would be appropriate to do that for a bonus, but not really for base pay. And we think the city provides a model for looking at metrics, which would be the mayor's management report for at least the agency commissioners, as to what we would want to see in terms of performance. I don't know what it would be for lawmakers, but I think there's limited time to really flesh that out, and maybe that's something that's best left to the legislature itself. Thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Questions?
Yes, thank you for a very thoughtful testimony. We really do appreciate that. You talk about the limit or restriction of outside income. Do you make some distinction, because the issue really isn't the amount of the income, but whether the income could constitute some kind of conflict? So one could say that even if you limit income, the fact persons are getting, there's also the appearance of a conflict. So, but you still would be comfortable with a limitation rather than an outright restriction?
We're following the model in Congress, which provides the limitation of 15% of the highest paid lawmaker in our example, which would be 15% of $145,000. The reason we think that's appropriate is there's limitations both on the type of work that they can have, but also we think by lowering it to an amount that's $20,000, that will mitigate any concerns about the appearance of a conflict or an actual conflict, because most of their salary will be coming from their base salary or an additional stipend for being a leader.
Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Susan Lerner from Common Cause.
Testify about the second citizen taxpayer action. You have the brief, the appeal brief, and the 3-volume record on appeal. You're an attorney.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for holding a public hearing and hearing the full diversity of opinions that people hold in our state on this topic. I want to concentrate on the question of the legislative pay raise. We haven't delved in great detail, quite frankly, on the question of the executive and the administrative side of things, and we endorse the recommendations from reInvent Albany in that regard. I think the key issue really is the question of the size of an increase, quite frankly. There has been too much time that has passed without any increase. And we think that from a management point of view, that's problematic. One of our recommendations going forward, which I know is outside the purview of the committee, is that New York State needs to follow the model from New York City more closely. We need to have a regular proceeding to determine compensation. It should be a management question, not a political football. And the longer that the state goes without reviewing the issue of compensation, the more politically fraught it becomes and the more difficult the decision is. And we'd like to see that pattern changed. When there are no raises coming, or at least an evaluation on a regular basis, we see workarounds like Lulu's. One of our basic recommendations is that there should be one salary level. The only escalators should be for people who have truly significant administrative responsibilities, like, for instance, the speaker. It seems to us that the Lulus are a workaround for the lack of regular review of a compensation level. If we want to attract and keep talented people in public service, either elected or appointed, then we have to be cognizant of the competitive marketplace. Public service is never going to pay as much as being the CEO of a large corporation or even a middle manager, or certainly not as much as being a mid-level partner in a large law firm here in New York City. But it has to be more competitive. We can't have a situation where the salaries are frozen for 20 years. And what we're seeing right now, interestingly enough, is a competitive marketplace between two legislative bodies, where because of the New York City proceeding, where we took exactly the same position that we are taking here for state-level raises, the New York City Council has a substantial raise, and we have seen in the intervening year several members of the legislature from New York City make the decision that it is advantageous to their family's finances to return back to New York City and run for city council. The decision of which legislature to serve in shouldn't be based on the fact that one legislature pays almost double the amount of the other legislature. So that puts us in the somewhat anomalous position of saying they should be comparable. We opposed the full raise to the 148.5 that the City Council had proposed at the time. We strongly endorsed the Quadrennial Commission's suggestion, which was in the 120 range. But having made that jump, I think we do have to be cognizant of the fact that a competition in pay should not be a determiner as to where somebody is serving. We consistently, strongly recommend and support limits on outside income. It is our position that there shouldn't be any. And in my testimony, I cite to a study which we did in 2016, which we haven't had a chance to go back and review, but I think the information is, if anything, the number of members of the legislature who do not have any significant outside income is likely to have increased, not decreased, in the preceding 2 years, in the past 2 years. And it was also interesting to see that for those legislators who had outside income, the outside income was averaging between 47 and 80,000. And if you actually adopted the same pay scale as New York City, then those families would not have a economic decrease, but rather it would stay comparable. Obviously not counting the Lulus. We think the Lulus just are an invitation to favoritism and to undue influence. So We think there should be a substantial raise. We think it should be coupled with an outright ban on outside income. We believe that our elected officials should be working first, foremost, and only for the people who elect them. And this is a way in which that can be clear to the very few number of the legislature who don't seem to have gotten that message. So since most of them are already there, let's bring the rest of them to that point. If a ban seems to be too much to jump to in one leap, which I don't think it is, we would say that a compromise would be the congressional system, which is a 15% limit on outside income and with significant controls on how that income can be generated. And that's, I think, the essence of our testimony. We do think it's an unusual procedure by which you were appointed, but we think that if you do the analysis, frankly, you have been charged to, in essence, submit a piece of legislation to the legislature, which through action or inaction adopts it, and therefore your recommendations become a statute in the force of law. And I think that that will stand any test. And I would be surprised if there were a test, because the people who have standing are the people who are getting the raise, but also politically, who in the legislature is going to stand up and really try and undo your work. So I urge you to be bold. I urge you to look at the totality of the circumstances and, frankly, to follow the model in New York City, where the city council, when it adopted the raise, also adopted the limitations on outside income and Lulus. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Susan, for coming in. If I get you right, you said that you're for a raise, substantial raise.
Correct.
But as part of that, you recommend that we should ban outside income, and we should ban the Lulus, right?
Correct.
The
Correct.
stipends. But you don't want to take the assembly, if I hear you right, to the comparable city council pay.
No, the legislature.
What would your recommendation on, if the legislature banned stipends and
And
outside
Lulus,
income?
and outside income, then I think that the legislative pay should be equal to the city council pay.
Which would be $148,000.
Yes, which is a big jump, no question about it. And one of the reasons why we need to get out of the political arena and into the management arena, right? Because as I said, there are other consequences to having these varying levels for our state legislators in our city.
I actually think that makes sense, because I think if there had been traditional raises all along, we would probably still be here, but not jumping them significantly
That's
because
correct.
their pay. So I don't think someone should be penalized
Right.
if we're going to do other things.
Right. I don't see, I'm not
Okay.
suggesting a difference in the pay level between the two houses.
Okay, that's what I wanted to
No.
clarify.
Mr. Thompson? Susan, thank you for your testimony today and always the thoughtful input from you and from Common Cause.
Thank you.
So you mentioned a preference for, no, I didn't, I had a question.
My apologies. It seemed like such a dismissal.
It wasn't just a bouquet. You mentioned a strong preference for an outright ban on outside income.
Correct.
But a willingness to support a compromise similar to how in Congress they handle the issue of outside income. Putting aside the question of a dollar threshold, how do you feel about certain kind of work? For instance, when I was there, I periodically taught a course, whatever I got, 1,500, maybe 2,000, depending on the course. Teaching, writing a book. Would you, even if you went for the more restrictive limitation or a ban, would you provide some flexibility for those kinds of activities?
I think that is something that is reasonable. I think once we're talking limits, there have been some controversy regarding outside income from books in our state. And so I think the idea of limits on even permissible types of outside income is an important one. But I think when we're talking about teaching courses, when we're talking about writing books, I think we're adding to the public discourse in a way that is very healthy for our elected representatives to engage in. I think it's a benefit to all of us if we have elected representatives who are thoughtful, who are doing reading, who are doing thinking, and contributing to what is a necessary civic dialogue. So that's something to be encouraged. Lecture series, although hopefully it wouldn't be a situation where people were getting $450,000 from an unnamed investment bank for speech, but,
Especially you.
a reasonable honorarium, again, where it's not a tremendous amount of money, seems to be well within the idea of encouraging our elected representatives to fully engage intellectually in the issues of the day.
I appreciate your comments. I actually think it's a good thing when elected officials are in a classroom and engage with students.
Yeah.
And I don't know what our SUNY and CUNY heads think about that, but I actually think it was helpful to me when I did it, and I'd like to think it was helpful to the broader community's conversation. So.
Yeah, it's a good reality check
Yeah.
to talk to young people and get their reactions to what sometimes we take for granted.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you.
As always, your organization comes forward with thoughtful ideas for us. You said that you supported recommendations of reInvent Albany. One of the things they touched on, no one else has touched on, is the whole idea of per diems. And their suggestion was a limitation on the number. I think in their testimony, they indicated that the average was $10,000 in additional income for per diems, but some people spent more time in Albany and some went as high as $20,000. So do you have any comment about whether per diem should be examined and what might be a conclusion?
I think per diems need to be examined. We know, unfortunately, that some people have run into problems misunderstanding the purpose of per diems. And when we are looking at a substantial increase in pay, I think we also need to look at what are the other benefits that are obtained. And I think that we need, in the same sense that federal employees, right, are subject to very specific guidance in terms of their per diem and some sort of oversight. So a legislator who, for whatever reason, is going to spend an entire 30 days in Albany and charge the public a 30-day per diem should have to answer some questions. Now, I'm not suggesting anybody has done that, but I'm just pulling an example of the kind of thing which would raise questions. And I know the procedure which the Comptroller's Office has put in place, I think, in terms of review later, after the fact, before the per diems are approved, I think is a helpful step in the right direction. But I think there are expectations, and I am not at all put off by the idea of a total cap on per diems.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now I can.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. James Call?
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this forum. If the New York State Legislature wants to, quote, encourage more people to run for public office, participate in the political process, and promote democracy, as stated by the Assembly Speaker in his testimony today, as justification for increased compensation, they can immediately achieve this objective not by spending more taxpayer money on their salaries, but by implementing laws that make the process for candidates to gain ballot access easier than it currently stands in our state. In addition to Lulu's and outside income, laws that reform our election system to encourage competitive contests should also be part of the conversation about compensation. My testimony today, however, is not a judgment on whether Albany officials should get a pay raise. It is instead a criticism of the device being used by lawmakers and Governor Cuomo to reach into the pockets of hardworking taxpayers in a way that is in sharp contrast to the spirit and letter of the New York State Constitution they each took an oath to uphold. I also previously took an oath to the New York State Constitution when I was sworn in as a New York City police officer at age 24. For 21 years, I took that oath and the powers and limitations it bestowed very seriously. I took it so seriously, in fact, that in 2013, I started a not-for-profit called ChangeNYS.org to promote civic education and the importance of constitutional study in our state. In addition to me and countless others, each member of this committee has also taken an oath to uphold the state constitution. With that in mind, it was alarming to read after this committee's Albany hearing earlier this week that Chairman McCall stated that if someone wants to challenge the committee's constitutionality, they should, but we did not make that decision. Once again, each member of this committee before us today took an oath to uphold the Constitution, which makes it more than the responsibility of our judges. It makes it each of your responsibility as well, You cited the judiciary as the only source in determining constitutionality, Chairman McCall, and that's unfortunate. While many of our jurists work hard to uphold the law, I can attest that the courts may not always be the best remedy for an engaged and informed citizen, even when the law is on his or her side. I filed a suit against the near identical power grant of this pay raise committee that had been given to a pay raise commission established in 2015. The case did not even see the light of the day after it was answered with a one-page dismissal by Judge George Peck in Nassau County, who admitted that the conflict that, quote, this court has a financial interest in the outcome of this case, yet he dismissed it anyway. It is interesting to note that the only person who was to represent the legal interest of this committee by appointment, our state's chief judge, recused herself just a few weeks after being appointed. So what are the constitutional clauses in question today? We start with the fact that this committee has been authorized with the ability to magically have their recommendations transformed into the force of law as authorized by the April budget in Part HHH. This false premise that the legislature and governor can give away their constitutionally allocated role in lawmaking to a handpicked committee should be so obviously unconstitutional that it need no further explanation. New York's Constitution is crystal clear on who has the ability to make law, and it makes no reference to a committee such as the one before me today. Article 3, Section 7, no money shall ever be paid out of the state treasury or any of its funds except in pursuance of an appropriation by law. This clause mandates that money spent by the government is appropriated by law, not by any other means. Article 3, Section 6, each member of the legislature shall receive for his or her services a like annual salary to be fixed by law. We continue in this clause the theory that money spent, even on the salary of lawmakers, is appropriated by law and not by other means. Article 3, Section 13, no law shall be enacted except by bill. This clause mandates that every law, even the ones described above detailing how money is spent on the salary of lawmakers, are enacted by bill, not by any other means. Article 3, Section 14 requires specific affirmation of a bill in order for it to become law. No bill shall be passed or become law except by the assent of a majority of the members elected to each branch of the of the legislature. This clause mandates that no bill, and there is no wiggle room here, becomes law unless it goes through both houses of the legislature. If the legislature and the governor can delegate away their lawmaking power on the specific issue of compensation and the spending of taxpayer monies, what other areas of lawmaking is the legislature and governor authorized to delegate power to other forums such as this? When the state legislature gave away its power to redistrict following the results of the next constitutionally mandated census to a commission, it required a constitutional amendment, which was approved in 2 sessions of the legislature and overwhelmingly by voters with 50% of their vote in 2014, as required by the state constitution. The power delegated here needs to go through the same process in order to empower this committee. Do we, the voters, have the right and power to hold our elected officials responsible for anything? The Constitution is clear that we do, and committee members present today must know that your work has the potential to absolve them, the lawmakers of our state, of the very responsibility and accountability that is mandated in the state constitution. One other brief point. Another issue is the presence of the state comptroller on this committee, Mr. DiNapoli. The comptroller under Article 5, Section 1 of the New York State Constitution is constitutionally barred from participating. Quote, the legislature shall assign to the comptroller no administrative duties excepting such as may be incidental to the performance of his or her functions. Nothing in those duties outlined in the Constitution includes lawmaking. One other brief matter. Thank you for allowing me this time. The time frame under which a pay raise may take effect for Albany lawmakers is a serious flaw in our state constitution. In contrast to the U.S. Constitution, which mandates in the 27th Amendment that no law varying the compensation for the services of senators or representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives. Sorry?
I'm going to have to ask you to conclude.
Okay, I'm just on my last paragraph here. Our state constitution says that one session can determine for the next session, and that allows for our current situation, where 1 month and 4 days after an election, a pay raise can be authorized, and it could take effect, and the voters of the state of New York will not have a say in that for the next 22 months. As I stated at the start of my testimony, I'm not passing judgment on whether Albany lawmakers should get a raise. I'm critical of the device being used by lawmakers, Governor Cuomo, and now this committee to reach into the pocket of hardworking taxpayers in a way that is in sharp contrast to the spirit and letter of the New York State Constitution you each took an oath to uphold. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So I'm here, even though you don't think I should be here, so I got to ask a question if you don't mind.
Please, yeah.
I don't know if you're...
Fellow Hofstra.
I don't... Oh, great. What year?
I don't want to say on camera. 95.
95. Oy, okay, I won't mention my year. I don't know if you're attorney or not, but obviously you've studied
I'm
the
not.
issue from a constitutional perspective. One of the suggestions at the hearing we had in Albany is that we should have a differential in pay for legislators based on geography, on the theory that broadly defined downstate has a much higher cost of living than upstate, broadly defined. Do you think that that would violate the part of the Constitution that says legislators should be getting the same salary if we would suggest a geographical differential in
I think
pay?
it would. I mean, first of all, I don't think, I think that what the committee should be doing is making a recommendation, which is what committees do in almost every other legislative pay raise authorization, and then the lawmakers vote on that. That's constitutional. But to go to your point, whether a pay raise can be allocated different based on geography, the Constitution says that the salary shall be like, according to law. So I think that that would be a question about the Constitution. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just somebody that took an oath to the Constitution and then read it and got really interested in it and teach constitutional history at this point.
Great. Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you very much.
Diane Berman?
Good afternoon. Before we start the clock, I did time it. It's 3 minutes and 10 seconds if I speak at normal speed. so-
That's fine.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Diane Berman, and I'm appearing here in my personal capacity. In June of 2013, Governor Cuomo nominated me, and the Senate confirmed me to my first term as a commissioner on the New York State Public Service Commission. Then in June of 2017, Governor Cuomo again nominated me, and the Senate confirmed me to my second term as a PSC commissioner, where I currently serve through a term until February 2024. There are statutorily 5 PSC commissioner positions, with one of the sitting commissioners appointed by the governor to serve as chair of the commission. Since February 2015, there has been a vacancy on the commission, and one of my colleagues currently sits in a holdover commissioner position. During this time period, the PSC briefly went down to only 2 commissioners. Since my time on the commission, I have served under 4 commission chairs, and I'm currently the only female PSC commissioner. According to See Through New York's website, it shows that in 2017, 123 employees made more than me. Every day in my role as a commissioner, alongside my fellow commissioners and the dedicated staff at the Department of Public Service, I endeavor to work hard to find ways to deliver to all New Yorkers the power and telecommunications they need in a way that is safe and reliable, that is fair to consumers and businesses alike, and that is environmentally sustainable and economically sound. It is quite frankly my dream job, and one that I take very seriously. I wish to make a positive, lasting impact in my role as a state energy regulator. We have all heard the arguments in support of raising the salaries of New York legislators and commissioners. To me, essentially, the arguments boil down to 2 essential points. One is rooted in common sense, the other is rooted in fairness. In an interview last week, the governor said that it's important to raise the salaries of state agency commissioners to keep those jobs competitive. He said, and I quote, "You want quality in government, and you want to be able to attract people." The governor is, of course, right. His argument is firmly rooted in common sense. If you want to attract and retain the best commissioners, you have to pay them a salary that is fair. This brings me to my second point, the one rooted in fairness. Lawmakers and commissioners have gone without a raise for 20 years. There's no reason to belabor the point. 20 years without a raise is unfair. End of story. So I'm here with a simple request. As you consider those 2 points, the one rooted in fairness and the one rooted in common sense, please keep in mind that your decision should be one that includes all Executive Law Section 169 commissioners. Remember, not every commissioner in New York leads an agency. Like me, some serve as members of boards or commissions. But the arguments in support of a pay raise apply equally to us. We have gone without a raise for as long as every agency head and as long as every legislator. So again, I'm here with a simple request. As you do your work, please remember to equitably include all commissioners. It's the sensible thing to do, it's the fair thing to do, and it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Before you leave, I see where the Public Service Commission chair is making $127,000. As a member, how much do you make?
109.8. I'm on D.
Okay, that's all. That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Thompson, just a comment, not a question. First of all, thanks for being here. Thanks for your service. And my observation, I appreciate the fact that as a commissioner, you're a very independent person, and you have a tremendous sense of loyalty to the job that you've undertaken. And I appreciate that, and I recognize
Thank you.
that.
Thank you
So-
very much.
So your 109,000 has been set for 20 years?
109.8, yes. Right. And I should say, before this, I was chief counsel to the Senate, and I took over $30,000 pay cut to come. It's not about the money, it really is about the fairness, though.
We
Thank
do
you.
appreciate your comment.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Our last speaker is Roxanne Delgado.
Hello. My name is Roxanne. I reside in the Bronx. I'm not paid to be here. I'm not part of the bad government groups. So these 2 meetings today and the one in Albany, New York, was barely publicized. Indeed, there was virtually zero outreach to the community about the meetings. The November 28th public hearing live stream is not available, nor is it on your YouTube channel or your website. So please. I don't understand why the governor and the legislative can't give their power of lawmaking to a panel created to raise their salaries. They should be transparent and do it themselves instead of creating this panel that has already agreed to give them a raise before the public hearing. Yet this panel doesn't have the power to create those needed reforms to clean up Albany, which is why this panel should not exist. Let the governor and the legislature raise their salaries with the needed reforms. As per the legislation that established this commission, the chief judge of the state of New York should be on this board. So this board is not in accordance with the legislation that created this commission, or this committee. Just in the Bronx this year, there are 5 new elected state officials. In the state, during the last 2 years, at least 40 new members are elected to the state legislature. This narrative that the state elected have not received a salary raise in 20 years is a false narrative, so I'm sick. Also, there are those who have been in office for over 20 years, and they chose to run for re-election knowing the salary base. They had the option to seek re-election, to not seek re-election, and seek employment elsewhere. False comparison. City council salary is $149,500, yet they have term limits, and they have a year-long session. State electeds don't have term limits, and the session is only 5 months. If they want the $149,500, then it should come with term limits. Also, after 2 terms, they have pensions, while their counterparts in the state council do not have pensions. Corporate CEO manager comparison. Again, apples and oranges. A CEO or corporate or manager needs a solid work and educational background, including a CPA, a financial license, including a CFA. But a person came run for office with no experience and no education. In fact, both our city and state controller have no financial background, nor do they have a CPA, yet they ran for controller. I am against the state controller determining his own pay raise and voting on it. This is a conflict of interest and another reason why this panel should be disbanded. The Democrats just gained control of the state Senate. If they want to thank us Democrats for putting them there, they should serve us first. Why are they making this priority to give themselves more money? And as Mr. McCall said, he had discussion with the minority and majority leaders in the Senate, those discussions should be made public, not behind closed doors. Okay, and they should also address our problems of MTA failure, homelessness, high rents. It's just so disgraceful that my speaker, who also resides in Bronx, will say that he can't afford to live on his pay while I make barely 1/3 of his make while making, I'm still surviving. It's just distasteful that our public servants are making 3 to 4 times more than people in the Bronx who are facing high rents, homelessness, lack of MTA, yet they don't address our issue, but the first thing they do as soon as they gain control is self-serve themselves and give themselves a raise. It's just so sad. This is why people don't vote. This is why we don't have any more trust and why the Democrats are going to lose control again, because again, they're already betraying us. They're not even in office yet, and they already stabbed us in the back. Okay, and I would like to know okay, and we have competitive elections. What we need is not competitive raises, we need competitive elections first. State goes to city for the salary. The reason why we have this musical chairs from state to city is because they don't, it's not for salary. They're not going for 30, they're going for the discretionary funding, which is just millions, because they have more power in the city council than they do in the state. Thank you so much.
That's our last speaker. Mr. Chairman, I'm turning it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Thompson, and to all of my colleagues for your thoughtfulness of being here today. We've heard a lot, and we think it was very useful. And, you know, it's really useful when people come and make their points and have a discussion, and we saw some of that today, and that has really helped us as we go forward to do our job. I just wanted to point out, we haven't made any decisions about anything, and we said we would not make any decisions until we've had these hearings. We, like many of you, wish that more people did show up, but they had the opportunity to do so. So thank you very much, and I'd like to have a motion to adjourn our meeting.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned. Thank you.